Well, let me first of all say thank you for inviting me, and I do feel honoured to be particularly in this part of Google's operations. I use your products probably once a minute. When me and Peter were working together, our success metrics were things like something called Barb, which is a sort of theoretical thing that tells you how many people have watched you on TV. My success metrics are now how many people watch my YouTube videos, and that's only in a space of 10 years. So, yeah, thank you, and I'll just consult my iPhone for the next bit of what I'm about to say. So, look. In my book, there's a big critique of what we call neoliberalism, free market economics, the current model of capitalism. And I'm going to cut to the chase and skip that over, because I think what I wanted to say to you is have a conversation with you about the more core idea of the book, which is the other bit of it, which is the idea that we may be entering a transition beyond what we know as capitalism. And that this transition is primarily driven by technology. And I want to kind of sort of explain what I mean by that and get your feedback on it, and maybe have a discussion with Peter and with yourselves about it. So there's been lots of people before me posing the question, can capitalism survive? Will it one day run out? Are there limits to it? Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, David Ricardo, the great economists of the 19th century, all were obsessed with the problem that capitalism might Malthus as well, the population specialist, obsessed with the idea that capitalism might one day reach its limits. But the reason we haven't for 150 years tended to worry about that is because whenever it has reached limits, whenever specific societal business models have reached a limit or an impasse, what has generally happened is that capitalism has adapted. And therefore, you know, when I went to university, the theory of complex systems didn't exist. Okay, in the late 1970s, it was in its infancy. But now, I think we have a really niche label to be able to talk about capitalism as a 250-year-old industrial system, and it is as a complex, adaptive system, which hopefully as engineers, some of you have knowledge of that concept, that systems can be complex and adapt. Now, in other words, I'm not saying, hey, capitalism's doomed simply because it has contradictions. I'm saying that capitalism might be about to transition to something else because it has lost its ability to adapt. And why might it have lost its ability to adapt? The answer is to do with the specific nature of information technology. Now, before we go into that, let's just examine the ways in which capitalism has adapted. Okay, I'm told you're mainly engineers, so that may mean some of you have not a massive grounding in social and economic history. But the sort of 101 version is this. About every 50 years, the societal business model hits a buffer, hits a problem. And what we tend to observe is a fairly rapid mutation of the system. New social institutions, new mixture of industry, finance, services, consumption. The classic one is in the 1840s, where the railways arrive to take over from an initial spurt of development that was fueled by the rise of the factory system alongside canals. You get railways. And then in the 1890s, you get what we call the second industrial revolution, this fusion of electrical engineering, of material science, of big infrastructure. Iron is replaced by steel, the telegraph is replaced by telephones, etc., etc. And then in World War II, we get this other adaptation, this huge synthesis, a new synthesis between technology, consumption, etc. One of the things we observe when we look as social historians at these moments of mutation and big change in capitalism is that there's nearly always, when something goes wrong, the knee-jerk reaction is nearly always for the elite to try and solve it through pressure on wages, pressure on consumption. Basically, you just cut everybody's wages and carry on as normal. And usually, up to now, what's happened is that hasn't worked because workers resisted. The 1880s and 90s are a brilliant example of this from social history. But this time, it didn't happen because the specific solution that was adopted when the old Keynesian economics of the 1970s and 80s fell apart was what we call neoliberalism. That is a free market system in which wages were more or less strategically suppressed. Some of you, any Americans here may know that the median hourly male wage in America was the same in 2008 as it was in 1973. So lower was much worse, higher was much better. And this is a problem because it means that, and this is the kind of clue number one why we might be facing strategic, big 200-year-long kind of epochal change, is that if you get a situation where capitalism is in trouble and it adapts through suppressing wages, then what it eventually does is it finds another solution to consumption, and that is credit. So since about the 1990s, we had a situation where wages are suppressed for the mass of people, and yet credit is very, very much more available than it ever was. What happens there is it's almost like a law of physics. Some of you physicians in the room, the law of physics, but it's economic. That if you got static incomes and ever expanding credit, then at some point the kind of wine collections and the art collections and the luxury apartments at Vauxhall Bridge cannot go on rising in value, and they just snap back. We call that a boom-bust cycle, and we've lived through 3 in 15 years. So this is a signal that something might be wrong with the economics that is not being actually solved by the technology. It's not being solved by the creation of new, high value, high wage, high sort of well-being synthesis of the kind you got in the 10 to 15 years before World War I. Okay. Now, here's my explanation, drawn on the work of others, of why that might be happening. Because information technology is different in the three following ways. First of all, it is corroding the price mechanism. Now, an economist called Paul Romer in 1990 wrote a paper that has gone down in history for its title because a British politician, Ed Balls, once tried to quote it in Parliament. It's called Endogenous Technological Change. But the 101 version of it is that if the reproduction cost of something is dictated by the actions Command C, Command V, then economics tells you that its price should fall to zero or close to zero, because you're using zero energy or almost no labour and almost no materials. We'll come to how much material, energy and labour you're using in a minute. But if you can copy something for free, then economics, mainstream, non-market Marxist economics, tells you that its price is going to be close to zero under conditions of competition. This is what Romer says. Also about information goods is they are what economists call non-rival. So if you smoke 1 inch of a cigarette, I can't smoke that 1 inch. I can smoke the next inch, especially if it's one of those cigarettes that you share, but I can't smoke the same inch as you. It's a rival good. Not true of an MP3 track. Not true of the database that builds a Boeing 787. You could copy it and use it at the exact same time for free. Now, Romer said, in this situation, the only thing that keeps the price mechanism, i.e. things cost more than zero, is if you artificially create scarcity, because information is now abundant. It's unlike all other goods. Obviously, there are limits to it. The limits are storage and bandwidth, but information is essentially abundant as far as most people are concerned. And so what you do to maintain any kind of price is you create artificial restrictions on it using either a widget that, you remember DVDs, you couldn't copy a DVD because there was a widget inside the protected software that takes, kind of 13-year-olds about 10 seconds to break, but nevertheless it's there. Or you get a good lawyer and you arrest every person in the car park of the supermarket going around with fake DVDs, and you sue the pants off everybody who tries to copy. You shut down BitTorrent, etc., etc., etc. Now, you can do that. But essentially, the good itself is replicable for free. The next thing information does, and you will be very, very aware of this, some of the audiences I speak to are just, oh wow, is it? Information delinks work from wages. information blurs the distinction between work and non-work, or what we used to call life, and it delinks work hours from wages. So my dad's generation, they turn up at a factory. If you're not there on the production line cranking the screw here, I can't tweak the nut here. So you and me have to turn up at the same time, and the work is sequential, it goes past. Best to give us both a little card, clock into a machine that goes clunk, and pay us when we arrive and stop paying us when we leave. That's work, that's capitalist work. Your work is different. I mean, when I tell people about the whiteboard and the yellow post-it notes who are not in the world you're in, they go, wow, really, do people work like that? But you'll know that the modular basis of most information work. You pick up the bit of the project, you work with it for a bit, you put the post-it note back, you record your work, somebody else can pick it up. Modular work allows very, very easily distributed and networked forms of organization. But it really challenges, what are we being paid for? So my common experience, like some of you, is you get on a plane to Brussels, you try and keep your elbows away from the person next to you, you try and do a bit of work. If it was a factory, it would be closed down on health and safety grounds, the kind of morning flight to Brussels. But we are actually all working. Nobody asked us, what time did you start work? Nobody really cares if I flip to the latest episode of Game of Thrones when I get sick of my spreadsheet, because we're working to targets, not to time. And that, in itself, is quite interesting, because it means at the higher level, we're all target-based rather than time-based. And at the lower level, we tend to create jobs in a lot of societies that almost don't need to exist. We could be automating a lot of work a lot faster, but the societal limits to it, our fear of creating, the Oxford Martin Institute says 47% of all jobs are automatable within 30 years. Our fear of doing it means we don't do it, and we instead create lots of person-to-person jobs at very, very low value that probably don't need to exist. The first time I walked into a McDonald's where you could touch screen and do your order on a touch screen and then swipe your card, I mentally cheered, because it's no fun being one of those people behind the counter. It's no fun standing in the queues going, am I being served or not being served? Is she serving me or not? And the whole thing is automatable. And who knew? When I first got a car, we used to put it into something called a car wash. Yeah? It was a machine. You put your coin in, and the thing came over you and washed your car. Who knew that 8 guys with rags could undercut that machine? They undercut it because labour is so cheap. And in other words, we're not forced to innovate. So that's the second thing, work and wages. And the third thing that flows on from the modularity is that organisations and hierarchies and ownerships are beginning to fragment as well. So you know that many people in your space, also in the open source space, will literally be working in non-managed hierarchies. They'll be working in very flat hierarchies. They'll be working sometimes non-managed. And in some organizations, the product is produced in a non-managed way. Wikipedia is a great example, because nobody tells some professor sitting in Seattle or wherever to do a page about Napoleon. They just do it. The organization facilitates the voluntary creation of a product. But you could see, those of you who use open source tools will know that, in fact, that way of working, it's not like somebody sitting in the middle of a committee. There is a committee on TCP/IP, isn't there? There's a committee that looks after it. But that committee doesn't tell people how to improve it. It just improves itself through interaction of people who use it and make improvements to it, Ruby on Rails, etc. So, these three things, the price mechanism dissolving, the link between work and wages dissolving, and then organizations and hierarchies being decentralized, falling apart, and the ownership of things not being clear. So who owns Wikipedia? Well, kind of technically probably Jimmy Wales probably owns it, but it is an open source product with which every other corporation on earth, if you trace their IP addresses, transacts every day, probably every minute. This is very new in the history of capitalism. So, the price for thing is the most important thing. Why? Because it doesn't just impact on information goods, on virtual things. In fact, I kind of rebel against the words cyber, immaterial, and virtual, because as the Oxford professor of philosophy Luciano Faridi tells us information is physical. Those of you who've studied cybernetics know about Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics in 1948, writes, information is neither mass nor energy. It is something new, and materialism has to adjust to adapt for that. I disagree with that, and Faridi does as well. I say information has its own dynamic, separate to mass and energy. Of course, funnily enough, the laws of that dynamic are weirdly mappable onto the laws of thermodynamics. But leave that aside. But it needs mass and energy for representation, and therefore it exists in the physical world. And that's what explains any physical good that is heavily dependent on an information content is also very susceptible to this exponential price fall that is inherent in the idea of information costs nothing to reproduce. And so you will know that if I add PowerPoint, the price of bandwidth, processing power, and storage is all over a 15-year period exponentially off a cliff like that. Deloitte, the consultancy, believes, I don't know whether this is true, believes that exponentiality will just carry on. They call them exponential technologies. And it means that we've never lived through, my dad's generation, my granddad's generation, industrial workers in factories, never lived through a period when a technology fell off a cliff in price terms. And how do we know that it's important? Because it's also affecting things like DNA sequencing. The exponential curve of DNA sequencing price fall is faster than Moore's law. It's actually bang, off a cliff. If you thought your kids would make a big living, a high value living, sequencing DNA, no they won't. What do we call it? Synthesizing DNA? Yes, because that's a lot harder. But eventually, technology will develop to a point where we can do that exponentially faster and cheaper as well. So, what happens? What's capitalism doing? How is it changing to defend itself against these problems? Well, you're sitting in one of the defense mechanisms. The evolution of the large technology company, which exists one way or another, I'll put it simply like this, to create a barrier around some information products whereby their price does not fall to zero. Now, your one is quite an interesting one. We could talk about the interesting way it is adapted. I'm a fan of it. But let me give you a good example. 99p a track on iTunes. What determines that price? Supply? No, the supply is infinite. Demand? No, the demand might be infinite, actually. We don't care what the demand is. Quality? No. The same track by some bog standard group is the same as a classic, rock classic, 99p. It's determined by the fact that Apple has a 95% share at the time I start writing this book of online digital music, or that which is paid for. They can dictate the price. That's the defense mechanism. Of course, then you create technologies that you have to use. It's easier to use certain technologies that help you maintain that price. Now, economics says that the moment that monopoly is subjected to effective competition, price should fall. And there's a website called Information is Beautiful who've logged the impact of competition. Because right now, to make the minimum wage in the USA, a solo artist signed to a record label will have to get 1,500 plays on iTunes of a single track to make the minimum wage. On Spotify, it's 1.1 million. So the price, the impact of competition has collapsed. Tell me what power of 10 that is. It's collapsed the price. Right. Now, to cut to the chase, there's that. There's the tech monopolies. There is the fact that we've actually begun to, as well as human beings, I would argue, live and create value and create our own social image much more outside work than my dad's generation did. You will know that workers for 200 years thought of themselves as kind of communities and factories. Now, through network technology, we create several personalities, and we live in networks. We live far more in networks. We are leaky in the terms of our personalities, ourselves, in a way that previous generations didn't do. And at the edges, we are beginning to see new forms of economic production. So all the open source stuff is a new form of economic life. It doesn't map onto the state, the market, the public library. It's different. And I argue that we might therefore be in the beginning of a long transition whereby the state, which we know, which provides, maybe 30 to 40% of GDP through providing essential services, the private sector, which has provided the rest, and then this new non-market, difficult to price, free stuff and voluntary in cooperation sector is growing up alongside it. What's the problem for me? If you use Ruby on Rails or PHP or whatever, it's not a problem for you. The problem for me as an economist is how do I value it? There's a brilliant tool called CATIA, which is used to virtually manufacture aircraft. If you look at the small print in Dassault Systems owns this software. It's about 25,000 a desk. It's a really top-end software. And in the small print of their annual report, it says, what's the main risk to this company? It says the main risk to this company is that somebody works out how to copy and paste the program CATIA 3.0. Because if they can do that, then the value of this company falls from there to there. So economics just doesn't know how to value or understand this third post-capitalist sector, and the challenge for us is to work out what to do about it and whether or not it's a good thing. I did a debate about this book a couple of weeks ago with one of Jeremy Corbyn's advisors, and a developer from the open source world stood up. This is in St. Paul's Cathedral, and said, "Well, what should happen to me then? Should I be paid wages for developing an open source product?" And I said, no, because that's post-capitalism. The point is, I write my Wikipedia page, I'm going to make a documentary and put it out for free, crowdfunded on Indiegogo, because I believe in this. I want to, I go to an organic farm and buy it because I believe in it. And I want part of my life to be non-capitalist. And this Corbyn advisor said, no, you should be paid wages. And in other words, they wanted to drag him back into the wage sector because he just couldn't understand what this new sector could become. I would like to expand that new sector for this reason. I once interviewed Larry Page and Sergey Brin before the IPO, and I said to them, what is your remaining ambition? And Larry Page said, I'd like to design a machine that knows everything. At which point there was this kind of massive jaw drop among kind of all the people who were sitting around because they all wanted to talk about company stuff. Yeah, I want to design a machine that knows everything. Well, there's an economist called Ken Arrow who was once the guru of economics in the 1960s. He was one of the first people to think about intellectual property. We used to think intellectual property was like a public library. We used to think information was like a public library. It was a public good, like a water system you turn on and off, and etc. It's just there. In the 60s, we realized it wasn't that, and we needed to economically classify it and understand it. And Ken Arrow came up with one of the neatest descriptions of what information property, owned information does. He says this: in a free market and with private ownership, if entrepreneurs produce patents and intellectual property, then the aim is for it to be scarce. Therefore, in a free market with private property, an information economy will lead to the systematic underutilization of information. Now, I would like to see a society where there is the systematic full utilization of information, and therefore, what I argue is that you probably can't have private property in a free market in information. And it's the property bit that I would like to attack. The market bit is good. It sorts out the information. It's the property bit. In other words, some of it should be free. It wants to be free. It should be free. And so what I would say to Larry Page now, I wish I'd thought of it then, but what I would say to him if I ever met him again is, you can't have that machine that knows everything, even this thing that you guys work on, which is a machine that is trying to know a heck of a lot. Yeah? It can't know everything for this reason. You can ask it any question you want, but I can't ask it all the questions I want, and therefore you don't know what my questions are. I can only ask it the dumb questions that I ask via the interface, whereas if it was open source, we could all ask it every question, and then your machine would know everything far quicker than it's going to at the current rate. I don't know what that means for the commercial model, but it means that if we all open sourced more stuff, then the leading edge of that which is not ownable, that is ownable, that has ultra value, that is innovative, would be far more identifiable, and we'd all have a far more equitable relationship with that which should be shared, which I think is far more than is currently being shared. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much.